higher and higher and higher. Our emblem is the Soviet star, and every propeller is roaring red front, defending the USSR. I can remember pretty far back. Two, three pioneers are we. We're fighting for the working class against the bourgeoisie. That was the song that I sang at a very young age. So I never did have any difficulty pronouncing the word bourgeoisie. As you can tell from those two songs, I grew up in a CP family, Communist Party family. And the first chants that I remember from the May Day parades were "Free Tom Mooney and the Scottsboro Boys." Tom Mooney was a trade union organizer who had been imprisoned, and the Scottsboro Boys were a group of young black kids who had been charged with raping a couple of white women in Alabama. They were in the early 1930s, and I'm talking about probably 1934, because the following year, I do remember the chant was "Hands Off Ethiopia," and that was in 1935 when fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia in Africa. Belonged to an organization which was called the International Workers Order, the IWO. My earliest memories is attending a summer day camp at the IWO Center in Brighton Beach. And at that time, I remember part of our project was to make puppets, and I made a puppet which was really the hero of the puppet show which we presented at the end of the summer. My puppet was a young boy who was very much influenced by all the comic strip characters. And that was Little Orphan Annie, who you remember her father was Daddy Warbucks. Terry and the Pirates which was against China, and Dick Tracy, of course, and a whole range of other comic strip characters, which were very popular as they were being read in the Hearst newspapers, the Daily News, the Journal American, and the Daily Mirror, all reactionary newspapers. And in the puppet show, at the end of the show, the hero puppet tears down the wallpaper, which is just filled with all these comic strip heroes and heroines, and underneath is a copy of The Young Pioneer, the communist publication for young people. At any rate, the following year, I started going to a Jewish socialist school that was part of the IWO. And I attended for locally school number 4 in Brighton Beach for the next 5 years, and then began to attend the high school. I had severe asthma as a child, probably because my father was a heavy smoker, but we did not know it at that time. And so I missed a lot of school, but was able to make up for it by doing a lot of reading. And I have probably read every fairy tale book that has ever existed. My mother introduced me to the Arabian Nights, and I had a teacher in the 4th grade who introduced me to Greek mythology. So I was able to be very all-embracing in my mythology. Of course, I was raised as an atheist, and you know, I knew these were all just stories. They were all just fairy tales, including all the major religions. It was a secular Jewish school that I went to, and I did very well. It's easy to learn a different alphabet and a different vocabulary when you're young. It's much, much harder to do so as you grow in years. In high school, I was among the top 10. I was number 9 on the list in a class of probably 1,200 students. And I continued that in college by being elected to Phi Beta Kappa. So at least I've been consistent in my scholarship. I also continued going to Jewish school during all this time, so that I probably had about 15 years of Jewish socialist education. And when I questioned my mother because I remember speaking to her about the differences between what I was learning in public school and high school and what I was being taught in Jewish school. There were discrepancies. And I remember her words exactly. She said, what you learn in public school, you vomit back at them. What you learn in Jewish school, that is the truth. So from the years 1952 to 1955, I spent those years at Yale studying nursing. Those were not good years for the radical movement. There was much persecution, and 1953 was particularly a bad year. First of all, Stalin died that year. And in June of 1953, the Rosenbergs were executed, allegedly for giving the atom bomb secret to the Soviet Union. Of course, that was a complete frame-up.
As a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist. But there are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently.
In 1955, when I graduated, the very next day after I took the state boards, I started my first job as a nurse in a camp for a summer camp for diabetic children in upstate New York. And that was called Camp NIDA, New York Diabetes Association. We were on duty in 8-hour shifts, but our shifts included the night shift because youngsters would, of course, go into shock during the night too, and we checked every camper. That was quite an exciting summer for me. And in the fall, I came back to New York and got myself a job as a visiting nurse with the Brooklyn Visiting Nurse Association, and had as my district my home area, my home neighborhood of Brighton Beach. And the district office was in Coney Island. And that I had never seen the poverty that existed in Brighton until I went into various homes and there really saw how impoverished people really were, even though they lived in a neighborhood which was considered to be working class, but upper working class. It was interesting to me how much poverty existed, hidden away, tucked away, in ways that we had no concept of. Of course, I considered Brighton by that time to be a glorified old age home, because all the younger people had moved out, further out on Long Island, if they could afford it, and only the elderly were left in Brighton, and a few diehards like myself. Along about 1956 or 1957, I had a friend who insisted that I had to go to a House meeting on the eve of the presidential election because he had promised a friend of his, a co-worker that he had worked with in the mountains of the Borscht Belt as a waiter. He had promised him that he would bring some friends to this house meeting. And that's how I first met Artie Rosen, although I never got to see the speaker that evening, but I did attend the House meeting and was surprised to still hear radical language coming out of people's mouths, even despite the years and years of the witch hunt. I subsequently became acquainted with Artie Rosen, and he tried in vain to have me read anything by Trotsky, because I was still very, very much with the communist point of view of that Trotsky was a counter-revolutionary.
Stalin's trial against me is built upon false confessions extorted by modern inquisitorial method in the interest of the ruling clique. There are no crime in history more terrible in intention or execution than the Moscow trials of Zinoviev Kamenev and Radek Petakov. His trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism. That is, from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people.
Well, he finally got me to read one sentence in the book In Defense of Marxism. And it was not a sentence that I could disagree with. I could not find fault with any part of it. And so I borrowed the book, and in the course of the next week or so, I read it and found that I did not disagree at all with any of it. Of course, that book was written in defense of the Stalin-Hitler Pact of 1939. And it was a very important document at that time. Actually, I was able to read also the companion volume by James Cannon, which was called The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. And I was able to read that too, and found very little that I could dispute. So at the same time, things were happening in the radical movement. The left had been pretty much decimated by the witch hunt. And so I began to attend meetings of the Young Socialist Alliance. Actually, I had many years before been interested in joining the Young Communist League, but just about the time when I was ready and eligible to join at the age of 15, the Communist Party dissolved the Young Communist League and formed the American Youth for Democracy. I had never found a comfortable home with them. I'm not sure exactly why, but we can go into that another time. However, with the Young Socialist Alliance, I did feel comfortable, and I attended classes that they held on a regular basis. And eventually decided to join the Socialist Workers Party.
Come all you Union seamen and listen to my song and join me in the chorus, 1,000 voices strong. Which side are you on? 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 My daddy was a seaman, and I'm a seaman too, but poor old daddy sailed the seas without the NMU. Which side are you on? 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 In days before the Union, I heard my daddy say, 'twas hardtack for your breakfast, boys, and peanuts for your pay. Which side are you on?
I really was not keeping up with the weekly newspaper, The Militant, and had not a clue in my own mind that there were different interpretations that were possible in regard, for example, to the uprising in Hungary, which occurred in 1956. Having been raised in a very monolithic Communist Party home, I didn't realize that there were more than one way of looking at world events. And I was surprised to learn that later on. My goal was to join the SWP on May Day. However, I was begged to please join a week earlier so that I could enter at the same time as two other young people did. One was Shane Mage, and the other one was Tim Wellforth. So the three of us were inducted into the Socialist Workers Party on the same evening in late April 1958. Once I was in the party, I found out very quickly that there was a minority viewpoint on all the major events. People thought that I had been recruited on the basis of that, of the minority position, but that was absolutely false. I didn't have a clue that there was more than one way of interpreting world-shaking events. And I found that the minority's point of view matched my own much more so than the majority's point of view, which saw a revolution in Hungary, whereas I saw counter-revolution. And it turned out that the minority saw the same thing. I was recruited to take a series of Marxist classes in the summer of 1958 by the minority up in Buffalo, New York, and I took a leave of absence from my job. I had been having a lot of respiratory problems anyway and had lost a lot of time due to being sick. So it didn't come as so much of a surprise when I asked for an LOA and was granted that. In the summer of 1958 in Buffalo, New York, there was a completely different atmosphere. For one thing, most of the members of the SWP worked in the auto plants in Buffalo. And so there was a very strong proletarian commitment in the party. At any rate, there were a number of us, a small number of us, that were taking classes. We took classes with John Black, who later became an organizer for Local 1199 of the Hospital Workers Union. And in the afternoon, we were taught by Sam Marcy. The Socialist Workers Party during that summer were in support of the Independent Socialist Party, which was running candidates for governor and other state offices. And we had to spend quite a bit of time getting signatures to place them on the ballot. The Buffalo branch was regarded as being responsible for getting 13 upstate counties to have enough signatures to warrant the ISPs being on the ballot. And we spent quite a bit of time going around gathering signatures. When that task was done, we opened up a storefront headquarters on what I refer to as the Mason-Dixon line in Buffalo. It was an area right between the black and white communities, and we opened up a storefront there, and it was staffed during the day as well as during the evening by comrades. And it was freely accessible to interested people who could walk in and engage us in conversation. At the same time, Sam was very cognizant of the fact that many of the wives of comrades were much less politically developed than their male counterparts. And so and having recognized that I had a background, quite a background in Marxism, he asked me to conduct a class, which I did conduct with 4 women, and we conducted a class on a daily basis. Childcare was provided by the party, and we had, I conducted a class of 2 white women and 2 black women, and we learned theory plus practice. We learned, for example, how to give a report to the branch meeting. And we all took our turn at the podium and reported on various activities that we had engaged in. And then the rest of the class critiqued the person who was doing the speaking. So it was a very practical class as well as a theoretical class. And by the time the summer was over, we were ready at that time for the formation of the Mothers Alliance to Stop School Segregation, MASS, because it was at that time that the first black student was going to Little Rock High School in Arkansas.
Have therefore, in accordance with the solemn responsibilities and the oath of my office, taken the following action. Units of the National Guard have been and are now being mobilized with the mission to maintain or restore the peace and good order of this community. Advanced units are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
Can you tell me your name, please? Are you going to go to school here at Central High? You don't care to say anything, is that right? This girl here was the first Negro apparently of high school age to show up at Central High School the day that the federal court ordered it integrated. She was followed in front of the school by an angry crowd, many of them shouting epithets at her.
That was a major thing in the news all the time. And the Mothers Alliance to Stop School Segregation demonstrated at the local Buffalo City Council and asked them to take a stand in support of the brave women who were sending their kids to school. At any rate, we had a very well-attended demonstration in support of the heroic mothers of Little Rock that were sending their children to an integrated school. And the Mothers Alliance subsequently became a local community organization, and was with the guidance of many of the people in the Socialist Workers Party. Now, at the same time, the party was having an internal struggle over major relationships to the world events that were occurring, that were continuing to occur. And one of the things that was happening was the development of the civil rights struggle. It was, in fact, due to one of the members of the minority in New York, and namely Artie Rosen, that we even knew about Rob Williams in an infamous kissing case that occurred at that time. A little black boy had kissed a little black girl and was charged then with rape. And he was much too young to have done anything of the sort. But this was on in Monroe, North Carolina. And it was at that point that the local NAACP leader said that they had to defend themselves from the Ku Klux Klan and the white racists who used to ride through their community every weekend. And he said that they would fight back with arms in hand. And he, of course, had been in the U.S. Armed Forces for a number of years and was well-trained militarily. And there was a great big furor about that.
I made a statement that if the law, if the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution cannot be enforced in this social jungle called Dixie, it is time that Negroes must defend themselves, even if it is necessary to resort to violence. That there is no law here, and there is no need to take the white attackers to the courts because they will be freed, and that the federal government is not coming to the aid of people who are oppressed, and it is time for Negro men to stand up and be men, and that if it's necessary for us to die, we must be willing to die. If it's necessary for us to kill, we must be willing to kill.
Now, I forgot to mention that during the month of September, the United Steelworkers Union had a convention in Atlantic City. And on the way back from this convention, one of the members who had been a delegate to the convention was a comrade of the Youngstown, Ohio branch named Ted Dostal. Now, I had met the name Ted Dostal on the same weekend that I had arrived. I had arrived the Memorial Day weekend in Buffalo, New York. And I remembered hearing that there was a complaint from Ted Dostal that some of the work that was being done by the Buffalo comrades in regard to a newsletter which he edited called The Militant Steelworker, had a problem with the lettering in the headline, which was a little crooked. And I remember Ted being referred to as, you know, being just too punctilious about things like that. But I had never met him and did not until the Steelworker Convention was over, and he went back to Ohio by way of Buffalo, New York. It turns out that he was also part of the minority, that he had a point of view which coincided with that of Sam Marcy, and that they had been carrying on a correspondence for years. And those were the days when people still wrote letters to each other, even theoretical letters to each other, handwritten, not necessarily typed. At any rate, Sam made sure that Ted, who was going to spend the night in Buffalo, was surrounded by company for his dinner meal. And that's essentially where I met him. And but that was it, you know, at that time. At any rate, the Mothers Alliance was going strong, and I returned back home to New York. My 6 months of my leave of absence were over, and I returned back home about 10 days before the fall elections in November, and resumed work. And instead of having my home neighborhood, I was now assigned to downtown Brooklyn, and I went to work there every day. Meanwhile, there was going to be a national committee meeting sometime in November or December, I don't even remember. And Ted came in as one of the delegates to that meeting. And I remember he talked and talked and talked to me about his work, the trade union work that he was doing, etc., etc., etc. And I remember approaching Vinnie Copeland the next day and asking him, I said, "Is Ted married? What do you know about him?" Well, he wasn't sure. He just didn't know. It's very interesting that a lot of people were comrades and knew very little about the personal lives of the people that they knew politically. And I recall saying, well, he spent half the night talking to me about his work. And I recall Vince Copeland saying, "Are you sure we're talking about the same person? He's so taciturn." Well, I thought I knew what the word taciturn meant, but I went to the dictionary anyway, and in the dictionary it said silent. And I said, well, he sure wasn't silent with me. And that just goes to show you that when someone has a willing ear to listen, then the other person who is silent in the presence of speakers has something to say. At any rate, that was my experience with Ted. And we began to correspond with each other by mail. And now the minority in the party decided that in January, for New Year's Eve, they would have a get-together in Buffalo. And so people came that were members of the minority. There weren't very many of us outside of Buffalo. Buffalo was the stronghold. But there were a few people in Youngstown, Ohio, and that was probably it. Now, at the same time, during the Christmas vacation, there was going to be a convention of the youth group of the Young Socialist Alliance. And it was going to be in Detroit that year. And what happened was that I wrote a document for that event, and so did Artie. He wrote a document also, and I couldn't get time off to attend that convention because I really had used up my sick time, and so it was read for me by another member of the minority in New York City, and it was read for me, and people were convinced that I had been brought into the party, into the Socialist Workers Party, on the basis of the minority point of view, but that was absolutely not the case. They were so disciplined that I didn't have a clue that there was even a minority position on anything. And it was only after I had already been inducted into the party that I found out that there was a minority point of view which corresponded much more closely with my own ideas concerning world events. At any rate, my presentation was not well received, needless to say, and nor was the minority position on world events. You know, among other things, for example, the minority position recognized that a socialist revolution had occurred in China in 1949. It took I will say this, it took the Socialist Workers Party 10 years to recognize that a revolution had occurred in China. And even then, they said that they had backed into it, that it wasn't. They did not understand the significance of Mao's leadership at all.
接着举行盛大阅兵式，朱德总司令检阅了海陆空军，并宣读了中国人民解放军总部命令。中古未有的人民革命的大胜利，也是社会主义和民族解放的具有世界意义的大胜利。
We had decided that to allow the New York contingent, which was Vince Copeland and his wife Libby, we decided at that conference that we had for New Year's, we decided to allow them to make the decision as to when they would do the splitting, whenever it was propitious, whenever the time was propitious. And meanwhile, Ted and I were getting along famously. And I decided, since that was always a consideration for me, to see whether I could survive in Youngstown, Ohio, where the only body of water was Lake Erie and not the Atlantic Ocean. And I did go there just for a night or two, just to see whether I could possibly live there. And Ted, by this time, had already asked me to marry him. And so I agreed. And I decided that I would leave at the end of January. I would leave my job at the Visiting Nurse Association and move to Ohio. And that will be another chapter.